In this video, we're going to start the creation of the terrain for our map, and we're also going to look at some different ways to create terrain. So we're going to come up, and I'm going to use File New. You may have had a splash screen come up, and you can choose Open a Map or New from there, or you can get it from the file system. In here, let's look at a few of the settings we have to work with. We have Height Map Resolution, which is going to determine the size of our map, and how many meters per unit that resolution is. And the math is pretty easy. The default is 1024 by 1024 at 2 meters per unit. So we have a terrain size of 2048 by 2048, or 2 kilometers across each direction. That is a really big map. We're not going to be using anything nearly that big, but I want you to see that you have choices from 128 up to 8192 for resolution, and meters from 1 up to 32. Now, if you use 32 meters per unit, you're going to have a lot of trouble molding your terrain. We're going to use a much smaller map. We're going to pick 256 by 256 and 1 meter per unit, which will give us 256 meters across. We're going to do an island map, so that's going to be more than big enough for what we need. We will give our level a name, about 3D Buzz 01, and we'll have another screen pop up, and we can just click OK through that. And I'm going to set at 2048 by 2048 for texture dimensions, and just click OK. And we get a big blue ocean. Now, if we pan down, we can see that it has created a base flat terrain beneath the surface of the water for us. And basically, it's set the terrain at ground zero, and the default for ocean height is 16 meters. That's going to be important for us to remember later. Now let's talk about a few of the different ways that we can create our terrain. If we go to our terrain editor over here on the left, we go up to File, we can import a height map. I'm not really going to get into that too much, and we're not really going to be using it. The second way is to simply generate terrain. Now we have a Generate Terrain button here, and if we go up to Tools, you can see we have Generate Terrain with the same button. So we will generate our terrain, and this gives you a procedural terrain. Now, the thing to note is that we get this settings dialog when it pops up. Feature size deals with how the height is determined. Bumpiness and noise deal with how much noise will appear on the terrain. Detail passes will determine how much of the noise detail appears on slopes. Variation is the seed number that's used. You have 0 to 32 for a total of 33. Blurring, this yields progressively smoother slopes. And that's all you really need to worry about. I never really mess with any of these down here. I don't too often mess with these. I usually just edit stuff actually in the viewport. These settings are pretty good as they go. So we can procedurally generate a terrain now based on those seeds. And you can see it gives us a terrain with a height map. Now you can right click on this to drag it around and look at it. And alternately we can pull this down out of the way. And you can see that we are in a ridiculously tall mountainous terrain. Now why is that? I mean, obviously nobody could ever use that. Well, that's because there was some stuff we didn't do. So when we generate our terrain, we need to go in under Modify, and we need to set the terrain max height. Otherwise, it's going to default to 1,000 meters high, and you're going to create Mount Everest. So if we make that 128, now you can see that what it did was cut off what we have. So once you set that max height, you want to generate your terrain after you've set that. So we can regenerate our terrain, and now we get something a little more island looking. But it still may not be what you want. Perhaps you have a very specific map in mind. You probably should have a very specific map in mind for your game. So what we're going to do is paint our own. So we're going to get rid of this, and we're going to begin creating our own. We'll double check that our terrain height's at 128. We'll enlarge this window a little bit. And to your right, you should have a terrain brush editor. Now the first thing we're going to do is pick Flatten. We're going to give this a pretty big outside radius. And maybe not that big. That'll work. We're going to set a hardness of 1. Now what hardness means basically is if it's set to 1, then you're going to get the value that you set in one click. So if you were at 0.1, it would take you 10 clicks to get to the full value. If you were at 0.01, it would take you 100 clicks to get there. We're going to set our height at 20. Now remember, our ocean defaults at 16. So we want to be slightly above that. And then we're just going to come in. I'm going to paint around a little bit. Don't forget, you can use right click to move your map. And I'm going to paint a bit of a roundish island with a cove. You can paint whatever you like. Give a little detail in here. Make this side a little bit bigger. Now, there. Now, I like that. So it'll retain this, so we can close out the terrain editor, and we can have a look at what we've done. So when we get down here, we'll see that we've got our terrain here, and it's all slightly above the water. So far so good. That's what we want. Now we're going to come in and we're going to choose Smooth, and we'll increase the size of the radius of this. And anywhere where I want it to smoothly meet the water like a beach, I'm going to run this smoothing operation. I'm going to stick pretty close to the edge with most of it out in the water, so that I'm also averaging up the terrain that's underwater. Much like that. And then I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I'm going to continue smoothing at the spots I like around the island. You can do the same. This is really just for you to see that operation working. And then we will resume. Alright, we've gone ahead and done that. Now there is something else I want to talk about. Up here in Modify, we have Make Isle. This can be handy. It will certainly give you that island type edge where it slopes off into the ocean very nicely. However, there are two things to be wary of. First of all, it's going to really round out your map when it averages that down. And secondly, when you do that command, You cannot undo it. Undo operation will not be available. Are you sure you want to continue? We're not going to. So be wary of that. You can play around with that with some test maps and get a feel for what it does, but just be wary that you can't undo that once you do it. Alright, so next we're going to start giving a little bit more of a terrain feel to our island. So we're going to come over, we're going to switch from smooth to rise lower. Going to bring up our radius. And how big that radius needs to be will depend a lot on what your original choice for your terrain size was. This size looks pretty good. We'll bring up our inside radius. We want this to be pretty steep, so there we go. And you can do all of this in the viewport. I just want you guys to see this operation. I'm going to bring up our hardness, say 0.75, height of 1, and again, this relates not to how tall the terrain will be, but basically how much of a reaction you get when you click on the terrain. We're going to enable noise, and we're going to bring that way down. This is really capable of creating a lot of noise. And I think we'll make the frequency really low, like 0.5. Something like that. And then we can begin painting on our map. And that's pretty strong. So if we go and have a look at our map, we can see that that really started to pop up fast. And for this particular map, you'll see why later, I don't really want a lot of noise in my mountains. So I'm going to disable that, but I wanted you to see it. I might even bring that hardness down a little bit. And we're going to paint a mountain in here. I'm going to widen that out a little. And remember, it's a height map, so black is your lowest value, white is your tallest. I think we'll make a mountain back here. And if you're following along with the tutorial, I am putting these where I am for a reason, so follow reasonably close. It doesn't have to be perfect, especially when we're painting in our height map. So we'll work with some of that as we go. And that's pretty good. We'll play with that. So now we're going to close this out. And in the next video, we're going to go over some things we can do here in the editor to get our terrain just the way we want it. So we'll see you there.